A 2002 Times CNN poll on the eating habits of 10,000 Americans showed that 6% of individuals surveyed said they considered themselves vegetarian. But when asked by the pollsters what they had eaten in the last 24 hours, 60% of the self described vegetarians admitted that they had consumed either red meat, poultry, or fish the previous day. Hello, my name is John Carrigan, and you're listening to the Bioculture podcast. Today we're talking about veganism or vegetarianism, and more specifically, what science might be able to do to further and promote these aspirations. I think it goes without saying that the humble slice of bacon has been known to be the downfall for many a wannabe participant, or that the loss of cheese can be very difficult for those of us who decide that they no longer want to participate in dairy. Even if one is pretty happy with such a lifestyle, for many, animal welfare becomes less of an issue when they stumble past McDonald's on the way from a club in the early hours. So now, what if a consumer could partake in all these delights, or horrors, without the need to worry about the animals involved, all because there would be none involved? There are a number of companies that are bringing forward technology to produce animal products in the lab, and its proponents believe it could herald a revolution both in the food industry and possibly the evolution of mankind. Central to the existence of many of these companies has been the New Harvest Research Institute, an institute headquartered in New York. And here to us to talk more about that is Erin Kim, its communications director. Hello, Erin.
Hi, John.
Just before we go any further, I should probably declare our interest. I mean, as SOSV, we have nailed our colours to the post here, and we've invested in many of these companies. But I suppose as the lover of a perfect steak, I'll try not to make this too much of an advertorial. Can you tell me a bit more about New Harvest, when it was started, what its overall aims are, and how does it fund itself?
Yes, so New Harvest is a nonprofit. We're based in the US, and we're not a company, contrary to it's a common assumption that we're also a startup that's aiming to put a product out on the market. But we are a donor-funded nonprofit founded in 2004, and we were founded in those early days when this guy, Jason Matheny, who is now the director of IARPA, was wondering why advances in tissue engineering weren't being applied to the production of animal tissues for food production. He was seeing some of the detrimental effects of large-scale animal agriculture in countries like India and China that were starting to develop more of an appetite for meat and animal products. And he just realized that if that were to meet the levels of demand and production that we were seeing in the Western world, that it just would have very dire consequences for the planet and for public health and things like that. So the organization was founded back in 2004. It wasn't really active full-time though until 2013 when Isha Dattar was hired as executive director. 2013 is sort of when, as you mentioned, that cultured beef hamburger made its debut on TV when Mark Post in his lab at Maastricht University sort of did the proof of concept for that. And so that really put the idea of cultured meat on the map in the world. And that sort of brought a lot of interest into the idea of cultured meat and cellular agriculture. And that was followed by a lot of media interest and eventually startup activity. New Harvest had a hand in launching two of the startups in the space. So the first was Moo-Free, now known as Perfect Day, and they actually went through a startup accelerator in Cork in Ireland. And then after that came Clara Foods, which was working on egg white proteins from cellular agriculture. So
Yeah, do you see yourself as being sort of providing a role in the research and providing funding for that research, or more for sort of awareness or company support, or?
It's definitely more about research and just making the scientific research happen, period. So in our years of being in cellular agriculture, we've realized that an industry and even just a field of study can't really take off unless there's a foundation of basic open scientific research. And we started putting that message out around 2015 and kind of hoping that someone out there would start doing it and funding it, but it wasn't really happening. So we took it upon ourselves to start funding that open research through our fellowship program. So now we fund right now 5 full-time researchers in cultured meat research, and we're always looking to fund more too.
I mean, you mentioned cultured meat, and that definitely attracts an enormous amount of media attention. But there are other aspects. You mentioned the egg white.
Yes. Yep, and the milk proteins, any protein or material you could get from an animal could in theory be produced through cellular agriculture, either through culturing the cells themselves or by engineering yeast or bacteria to produce a particular type of protein as the final product. And so we've seen it applied to things like leather and spider silk and collagen and gelatin, as well as food products like muscle meat and muscle cells, fat cells, and so on.
And I imagine, of course, that some of these are probably much closer to the mark than others. How long would you think before we'd see, like, a meat-free steak? That's probably a bit far away, but other
Yeah.
products might be a bit close.
I would imagine that the acellular products, so the ones that aren't composed of the cells themselves, so the milk proteins and the egg white proteins and things like that, might come sooner than a full-fledged cultured meat product. Also, I think with materials, also you'll probably run into less of the regulatory issues and the consumer kind of hesitance around that because you're not eating those or putting them, in your body. So um, I would imagine that the non-food applications might be received a little bit better. And actually, there are products that have already been released. So spider silk has actually been, like products made of cultured spider silk have been put on the market in different iterations. And the fact that it's not produced from actual living spiders doesn't seem to be an issue.
And I mean, what would you say to people who would argue that there are already substitutes out there? So we can be vegan or vegetarian right now without these. So they could, I suppose, quite reasonably argue that why put money into this type of research when we could put it into other sort of health related issues?
Right. Well, Joey Ito actually wrote a really good article for Wired recently where he lays out these levels of meat substitutes, where level 0 is simply just be vegan and don't eat, just eat beans and high
Mhm.
protein like vegetables. And then level 1 up through, I think, 6 or 7 is like these various levels of things like seitan and tofu, which are still plant-based but kind of meat-like. And then there's kind of more novel products like the Impossible Burger, where it is mostly plant-based. Actually, it is purely plant-based, but there is a cellular agriculture component to the heme protein as an ingredient. And then after that, there's mostly plant-based products with a little bit of animal cell culture.
And in terms of, I mean, isn't this admitting that the vegan diet is actually, or the vegetarian diet is actually pretty tough? Which
I
is
don't know.
contrary to.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, I personally, I would agree with you. Like I've tried and failed every single time. And I mean, I think rather than admitting it's a defeat, it's an admission that animal products are, that there's something about it that is of value. It's so pleasing to the senses, and there's just I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't.
so maybe we were probably just being a bit more realistic that, there's only so many people will convert away from meat unless we provide them with good
With
alternatives.
something good. Yeah. I mean, I would agree because I mean, I am one of those people who've tried for various reasons to cut meat and animal products out of my diet, but I just come running back to them
Okay,
every time. So,
actually, you've just preempted my next question because
mm,
what type of people are sort of joining New Harvest or supporting New Harvest? I mean, are
yes.
they people who are like sworn off animal products, or is it just people who might be interested in just reducing animal usage in the area?
Yeah, it's become a pretty diverse crowd. So in the early days, I think we just naturally attracted a lot of vegans and vegetarians and people who were interested in the animal rights and animal welfare kind of thing. But as the years have gone by, it's gotten to be more diverse, and we've also made a concerted effort to bring in more people from the meat industry and farmers and meat producers and of course meat eaters with that, and beyond that, just people from other who are interested in this for other reasons too, whether it's because they're, interested in space travel, or they're interested in this as like a space to invest in, or they're interested in, or, they're just foodies, and they're interested in like the new culinary possibilities that this may offer. So
Hmm.
it's a pretty diverse crowd. Definitely, yeah, the vegans and vegetarians are a significant part of it, but they're not the only.
I was at the New Harvest, the annual conference in Boston, I think two
Yes.
weeks ago. Now, I think before I went and I was trying to explain to people what I was going to who don't know anything about this, I got the usual jokes about quinoa
Mm.
eating, yogurt knitters and what, etc. But I mean,
Mm.
it was really, really, I thought it was brilliant.
Oh, thanks.
And I think what really did strike me was actually the diversity of the people that were there. So
Yeah.
that farmers from way out west and up north, and
Yeah.
people from the regulatory issues. What were you trying to achieve in a conference like that?
Yep. So I'm really glad that you picked up on the diversity, and that was something that we made a real conscious effort to kind of like cultivate in our audience, and of course in our speakers and exhibitors. And part of that was, I think, a very valid critique of people observing in the early days that, it is a very vegan dominated kind of conversation, and why aren't more farmers being included? Why aren't more critical voices being included? And I mean, I agreed with that critique from the very beginning. It was a little bit harder to attract like the farmers and the meat eaters and the meat industry folks, because they just in the early days of cellular agriculture just didn't know that we existed and that we were having these kinds of conversations. And I think the publicity that the Post burger and like the media stories helped bring about, it did help kind of raise that awareness of the fact that we exist. And it was a little bit of there was a little bit of a warming up process to those audiences, because I think that they were a little bit wary, understandably, of cultured meat. I think a lot of people would be. I mean, I felt that way as well when I first heard about it. But over time, we've gotten to know a lot of the people, who are, say working for a big company, or they're meat producers themselves, and it's just like a slow process of like getting to know each other, and beginning to build a trust. And the other thing I think that helps with that is that we're not really like an advocacy organization. We're not out there trying to say that cultured meat and cellular agriculture are going to be this or that. It's really just at an inquiry stage. And so we're trying to invite more stakeholders and people, who are just purely interested.
I note that you haven't used the word clean meat
Right.
in this
Yeah.
conversation. Is that a conscious thing, or is that
Yeah, yeah, it's a conscious thing. It's not hard. It just,
very
to me,
loaded
it
word
doesn't
though?
even. I mean, I'm not a fan of it. That's I don't know. I actually don't think it sounds that great. I don't feel super strongly about it, but I just, haven't really been convinced about the arguments for the use of clean meat. And I think that the critiques of that terminology are also very valid. And, we didn't really have a problem with the term cultured meat.
Suppose from your point of view that if you're trying to have an inclusive model or invite a lot of people into dialogue, it's
Mhm.
probably not the most helpful term.
No, yeah, we've seen the reactions from the farming community and other audiences that just like they really feel insulted and offended by that word, because it does imply that there's an alternative out there that's dirty.
Mhm.
And I mean, the other thing too is we don't even really know if it is going to live up to all these hopes and dreams yet, because it hasn't been studied on a large scale. And the only prototypes that have been released and maybe and tasted, they haven't reflected the actual production processes that would be used if this is done at a commercial scale. So it's there's a lot of reasons why I don't use it, but
Yeah.
I am not,
It's,
everyone's
it's,
free to
out, it's
call.
out there now. There's nothing we can do about it as such, only.
Yeah, and maybe a new term will come that takes its place. And And that was a topic that was covered at the conference as well, because the terminology that's used is kind of a hot topic, and something that came up in the conversation was that maybe none of us in this field will have a real say in what it's called, because we're too in it, like we're too like we're in the forest.
Yes, depends
You
on who's trying to sell it, I suppose, or market it.
Exactly. And New Harvest is definitely not trying to sell it. So it's not really our place to brand it either.
Yeah, I was particularly also taken by your sessions on the regulatory issues because
Hmm.
this there's no regulatory mechanism quite there for this yet. I mean, who
No,
even does this? Is this the Department of Agriculture? Is it the FDA? Is it?
that's still up for debate. So the biggest move that's been made thus far in the US is that the FDA called for a public meeting to gather more information about this just the topic of producing foods from cell culture, from animal cell culture, and that was sort of seen as them kind of staking a claim to jurisdiction. And of course, there are others who are calling for the USDA to regulate it, because the USDA regulates other meats except for other than fish, and
Mhm.
there's probably compelling arguments on both sides, but it's yet to be seen. And I think it'll probably be some time, because there still isn't a product to
Mhm.
be regulated. There's not a process to really, be examined. And I think it's a good thing that the conversations are taking place this early on, but I don't know if there will be like a definitive answer for a little bit,
Mhm.
for a while.
I suppose that I mean, my impression of it after is it's one thing to set up a mechanism that will do this, and these conversations will start. But
Mhm.
having listened to the speaker at the conference, I forget his name now, who was
Mhm.
it was Aqua Bounty, is it for
Yes,
the?
Ron Stoddard. Hmm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
felt it. Like I said, I thought he needed a hug. It's a very long process,
Yeah.
and there seems as if a possibility of politics and various things comes into it. So it's one thing to have
Hmm.
a mechanism and a system set up, and it's another thing to actually adhere to it and to not be influenced by outside forces.
Totally. Yeah. And I think we all have a lot to learn from his experience that he shared with uh, the Aqua Bounty salmon. And hopefully going forward, we won't run into the same kinds of hurdles. And I thought, what I really took away from his talk was he called for like a need to be open and to publish papers and just have it all out there, because people are going to try to critique it and find
Make,
ways
make,
to hold.
make sure you're dealing with facts. I think that was a big thing.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and to have this, just the entire field of cellular agriculture be like a credible one, and one that the consumers trust. And because I mean, isn't that the underlying thing, is that people just didn't trust the the product because they had misconceptions about GMO and the process. So, there has been a shift, I think, since then, but it's,
Yeah,
of course, there's still work to be done.
it's a strange. A lot of people who obviously will support what you do will find themselves in a slightly strange place because, particularly, sort of animal rights activists and more traditional supporters on the extreme left or whatever, they wouldn't have been the biggest fans of GM,
Hmm.
whereas that's kind of a necessary part of what we're doing or trying to do here.
Yeah, it's interesting because food is so, like, the food ideologies and the tribes and the just all the different views and flags that you might wave that have to do with food. I find that it's really hard to like adhere to all of those if
Mhm.
you're interested in cellular agriculture, because on one hand you're maybe interested in taking animals out of the food system, but maybe there's a common belief there that if you're of that tribe, that GMOs are a bad thing. And we haven't really run into issues there, because generally if people are of the like anti-GMO kind of like view, they kind of just stay away from what we're doing, because it's naturally something that's maybe a little bit
Hmm.
scary
It,
or whatever.
it was a great conference. I mean, finally, so if people want to donate to New Harvest, where should they
Yes.
go?
They should go to our website. So we're www.new-harvest.org. You can donate online. You can write a check. You can do whatever kind of transaction works best for you. But even more than that, I would say sign up for the newsletter because we write a newsletter every other week that just has updates on our research and general cellular agriculture news, job postings, events, and things like that. And it's a very good way to stay on top of all that's going on in this field. So I would highly recommend that.
Okay, thank you very much, Erin.
Thank you, John.